You are listening to another podcast series by the Sacred Art of Living community, honoring soul-sized questions. Today's podcast is a part of a series called Soulful Grieving, the healing power of love.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Daryl Williams, your host for this podcast series called Soul-Sized Questions. Today's episode is part 2 of our discussion of soulful grieving. In this episode, Richard delves into the alchemy of suffering based on his book, The Alchemy of Grieving, the power of suffering and love to transform, a book he co-authored with his wife, Mary. I know you'll be touched by this magical presentation.
Okay. Now, the second point I wanted to talk to you about is an interesting term that maybe you've not heard before, called the alchemy of grief or the alchemy of suffering. It took me 10 years to have the courage to pull together a book called The Alchemy of Grief, the power of suffering and love to transform. And the reason why I was stuck, I couldn't write it, is because I wasn't the grief therapist in our family. My wife was. And I remember one year, about 10 years in after Mary died, of having this lucid dream around Christmas time. And it just shook me up. And I woke up, and in the dream, it was like she was right there, and she said, "You're missing it. Don't you realize? Go into my office. You've been afraid to go in there for 10 years. You won't open my file cabinets." And it's true. I found it very painful. And I have got a lifetime of information there on grief that we could co-author this book together. Well, the publisher was in London, and I remember calling him and saying, "I'd like to co-author my book with my wife who's dead." And I'm sure he thought I was crazy. We don't co-author people after they're gone. But when I explained to him what the story was, he actually allowed us to co-author this book. And so some of the insights that I'm sharing with you here come after the loss of someone. And maybe that's a bit of a cue for you as well. Alchemy is this wonderful ancient term, goes back thousands of years. The alchemists believed that you could put into the cauldron, into the melting pot, all of the right elements. And when you had them in there in the right proportion, transformation happened. The base metal could be turned into gold. That was one of the myths about alchemy. But much more importantly, what the ancient Greeks believed about alchemy was there was the alchemy of the soul. That moments of crisis were actually moments that defined and deepened our psyche, which is the Greek word for soul. So that concept really fascinated me. And I remember seeing this Jungian slide, if you look at it carefully, that when there's chaos in life, notice what starts to happen in alchemy. The chaos actually morphs ever so gradually into order. That's the power of alchemy, which is a powerful psychological tool and wisdom. Now, the alchemists believed that the only way out of grief and suffering was through it. If you try to numb it or narcotize it or push it aside, it won't work. It won't transform anything. It just goes deeper into our psyche. The poet Robert Frost wrote a book or a poem with this title on it, "The Only Way Out is Through." You think you can escape this suffering, and we can't. But instead of being frightened by this suffering, we can begin to take the alchemist's challenge with our grief. And in that, we learn the paradox of leaning into the pain, not as the source of more suffering, but ultimately as the source of healing. So we amplify in some ways the feeling and trust that that's part of the alchemy. In spiritual language, it's how you hold darkness and light together. The Quaker tradition has a wonderful practices around how that's done in a powerful kind of contemplative practice. But the warning here is that grief is as individual as the soul. Everyone's grief is different. We have to ultimately discover the unique alchemical elements that can transform our particular suffering. In other words, there's not a manual. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So I do know this, and Mary knew it as a good grief counselor, that there is inside of the psyche of each person, in the soul of each person, a powerful inner teacher that does know the way through. But because not everybody grieves the same way, it's important to know some of the differences that we should pay attention to. The studies, and this is really recent stuff now, around science, gender, and grief. The tending and befriending approach to grief, which tends to be the anima or feminine soul grief, versus the fight or flee tendency, which is the animus or masculine. We're not just talking about sexual differentiation here. We're talking about how each person has anima and animus in them. Shelley Taylor was the first therapist who began to write about the tending and befriending aspect of grief that women tend to do. And Tom Golden, who you just saw there in that little video, wrote a powerful book called Swallowed by a Snake, studying grief ritual of the masculine side of healing all over the world. That's just one aspect, though, gender. There's so many others. We want to have our pain taken away. And as much as we might feel that grief is a solitary experience, being present to another's grief is never about trying to take it away. I remember in the months after Mary died, the wonderful people in our community who came pouring out of the woodwork with books and recommendations, and people were trying to set me up with dates. It was just amazing what people were doing to try to heal and cure me of my grief. One of the rules, 101, that you can trust is don't ever ask a grieving person, just call me if you need anything. They're not going to call you. They're in grief. Just show up and leave the casserole or the fresh baked bread at the doorstep and ring the doorbell, or the flowers, or whatever it is. Companioning is just an amazing attunement to the world that that person is in. And one of the things that we do know, and this has now been scientifically demonstrated, is that nature is one of the great sympathetic healers in grief. That sometimes just getting ourselves out of our domestic environments into a natural environment, nature feels like a companion to us. So I would say a prescription for your sanity when you're having a grief moment is that no matter how stretched you are, find in your backyard, on your deck, in your house, a chair facing the bird feeder, a window, a sit place where you can just breathe and reconnect with the natural world. It is one of the best ways to get out of our heads and into our bodies. Walking through grief is one of the most powerful ancient spiritual practices, and I'm going to show you how this shows up in a variety of spiritual traditions. The one book that was given to me by a friend of mine down in Los Angeles that I actually appreciated during my early grief period was Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Death, No Fear. Not because I opened it up. In fact, I couldn't open up a book and read anything. But the title of the book stopped me in my tracks. No death, no fear. It's a koan, a riddle. Wait a minute. What do I believe? Really? It pushed me to the edge of my belief system. Do I believe? I don't care what I was taught in Sunday school or Bible school. What do I really believe about death personally? Now, in this place, is the last breath, it's over? And what about that possibility that if there really wasn't death, if physical death wasn't the end, then what would there be to fear? And that little riddle became for me a kind of a journey into a whole aspect of wisdom that I never would have experienced otherwise. We have in our Soul and Science library, and again, I'll show you at the end how to get a hold of it, a wonderful psychotherapist, a woman who has worked for years with grief as a therapist and as a spiritual counselor. And so I'll introduce you to Wendy Howard's videos at the end of our time here together today. You know, whether it's sitting Shiva for a week after a person dies, whether it's a scripture passage like the Beatitudes, blessed are the grieving, often people find, even if they've been disconnected to their religious traditions, the times of loss, they find some comfort in some aspect. Not everybody, but some people do. One of the most amazing teachers that I had is a man in Ohio who's an Aramaic scholar. Aramaic is a language not spoken very much today, a little bit in Lebanon and some places. It was the language actually that Jesus taught in. So the Bible, New Testament, wasn't written in Greek or Hebrew or Latin or English. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. And look at this beatitude. I always just think whether you're Christian or not, it's brilliant. Instead of blessed are they who mourn, what he really said was, blessed are those in emotional turmoil, for they can be united by love inside. It's kind of like Tom Golden's teaching about sadness, isn't it? So Rabbi Jesus is pulling on an ancient Jewish teaching and bringing it forward. My personal spiritual mentor, coach, friend, Richard Rohr, says ultimately, pain, it's not transformed, is going to be transmitted. We're going to pass it on. Others are going to be wounded by our unprocessed grief. So we have an obligation to deal with this grief, not just for ourselves personally, but for our friends and family members as well. And ultimately, what the alchemy of grief does is it pushes us to this place of helplessness, this threshold, this doorway place, and where we can surrender, where we can, inshallah, where we can hand it over. In that moment, grief can be transformed. I think one of the great grief books written, and I wanted to leave you with some resources, is Stephen Levine's Unattended Sorrow. He's a Jubu, a Jewish Buddhist. There were a lot of folks in that generation who wrote out of that tradition. And Stephen says, when we meet pain with mercy, there's a silent sigh of relief that can serve the whole world. There's no longer your pain or my pain, only our pain. The good grief work is not just for our own individual little wounded, hurt psyche. It is for the sake of the transformation of others in the world. So I'm just going to ask you for a moment, again, just to take a moment and jot down. This is a question that you may not have an answer to or may not compute, but have you ever experienced, in whatever form you would describe it, what you might call the presence of a loved one, of someone who died? If you ever did, how did that show up? Was it in a dream? Was it in a memory? Was it in a kind of lucid dream that I told you about? Is it in a piece of music? Was it through a grandchild? Could be so many different ways. So just notice that for a moment. See if that's ever happened to you. And you don't have to get lost here in belief systems. You can just trust your experience. That's what the mystic does. I had the experience. No one can take this away from me. I may not rationally be able to explain it.
We would like to thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Question of Belief. For more information about our entire podcast library, Asking Soulful Questions, visit our website at sacredartofliving.org.